Absolutely. First of all, thank you all for that wonderfully warm welcome here in Chicago and Lincolnshire. I'm delighted to be here. I also want to send greetings to everybody involved in tonight, to the event's chairs, to the board, to the organizers, to the sponsors, and of course to your honorees, and also of course to the Consul Generals who are here, Consul General of Canada, Consul General of Poland, and Consul General Ezra from Israel. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Because our Consul General's here, he didn't address the political situation in Israel right now. Now, Michael made some reference to this, and I just want to tell how I explain this to people, because I'm often asked in my various roles, what exactly is going on in Israeli politics? And I'll tell you what's going on in Israeli politics. There's this story. It's about the Prime Minister of Canada, and the Prime Minister of Britain, and the Prime Minister of Israel are in a bar together. I'm going to tell you whether this story is actually true. But anyway, the Prime Minister, they get having a few drinks and start bragging about their countries and themselves. And the Prime Minister of Canada says, you know, I'm the Prime Minister of some 30 million people. And we have the second largest landmass on Earth. It takes me up to 11 hours to go across the country. Well, the Prime Minister of Britain says, well, you know, Britain's not that big. But Britain is, I'm the Prime Minister of 60 million people. And Britain's a globally important country, everywhere. Well, the Prime Minister of Israel says, well, you know, Israel may be a small country, but I'm the Prime Minister of 8 million Prime Ministers. Anyway, thank you, Consul General, for that very kind introduction. And I tell you, don't watch my performance of Hey Jude in Israel, because I am a bit of an amateur musician. Of all my public performances, that was the worst. Anyway, thank you. And I also want to say that I can just say as well, Consul General, that introduction you gave me was one of the better ones I've had in my political career. I've had some that weren't always that good. I like to tell the story about the time I was in a school. An 11-year-old girl got up and she read the following introduction. She said, quote, "My mother says that it is not my job to give a long and boring speech. It is to introduce the person who will." Well, today I may be long, but hopefully I will not be boring. Because I know I've been invited to speak here at the Chicago Campus Champions Gala of Stand With Us, which for almost 2 decades you have steadfastly and often bravely stood with that remarkable country, the modern state of Israel, and stood against the perennial and always mutating virus of anti-Semitism. You engage, you educate, you empower. In a free and democratic society, it is what we can do and the best that we can do. Now, I should also mention that speaking to organizations like this is still a relatively new experience to me. As you know, I'm coming off a decade where I was Prime Minister of Canada, something for which I will always be grateful to the people of Canada. By the way, I get asked questions. I say, what is it really like being the Prime Minister of a country? What is that really like? Well, I put it this way. You know you've arrived when the police drive up to your house, they come to your door, they get you, they take you down to their car, they open the door for you, and they don't push your head down when you get in. Anyway, in my capacity as Prime Minister of Canada, I spent time in meetings around the world, meetings with some of the most powerful people on earth, where, unfortunately, my voice in defense of Israel was often a lonely one. But I tell you this, it was a clear voice and a consistent voice, one that was supported by every single member of my cabinet and of my caucus. And that is to say, our position was this. Our government's recognition of Israel's right to exist was unconditional. Our support of Israel's right to self-defense was unequivocal, and our refusal to single out Israel for attack and sanctioning was unwavering. Tell you this, because this is important as you look at the politicians and political options who come before you. I took these positions, and my government took these positions, not just in front of groups like this. My experience is that every politician is a friend of Israel when he is speaking to a Jewish group. We took these positions at the very moments when Israel was being most vocally condemned and abandoned by its supposed friends around the world. Now, I'm often asked why. Why did I take these positions? And the first thing I say, it's sad that I'm asked this question. Because a generation or two ago, no one would have asked a Canadian politician, or for that matter, a politician of any Western nation, why he or she supports Israel, supports its right to exist, supports its right to defend itself. A generation or two ago, you would just assume that they did. You would have been perplexed had they not. But after more than a generation or two, during which in Western countries, media, academia, and international organizations have made attacking Israel something of an industry, the question, unfortunately, is now asked. To be frank, ladies and gentlemen, friends, if I may, contrary to what you may have heard, my support for Israel is not for religious reasons. It is not based on a particular biblical interpretation. In truth, my support for Israel did begin with my upbringing. As far back as I can gather in my family tree, my ancestors have always been pro-Jewish. I know my great-grandfather was, and my grandfather was, and certainly my father, Joe Harper, who passed away in 2003, was a lifelong supporter and admirer of the Jewish people, and because of that, he was also a supporter of Israel. And he was a strong and he was a vocal opponent of anti-Semitism, and he was in an era when the opposite view was very common and often very openly expressed in Canada. But my father not only believed that opposing anti-Semitism is morally right, my father also believed that opposing anti-Semitism is extremely prudent. His views came in part from having grown up during the 1930s. He often reminded me of the widespread excuses made in Western countries for Adolf Hitler during the years of his rise. And he believed that the lesson of history is clear. Those who, like Hitler, begin by hating and threatening the Jewish people will inevitably hate and threaten all of us. And this goes to the core of my support for Israel as Prime Minister. My view was that the support for the State of Israel is of vital strategic importance. It is a matter of our own long-term interests. That is the long-term interests of the Dominion of Canada, of the United States of America, and frankly, of the wider Western world. Israel is a part of our wider Western civilization, and it is the only real, unequivocal, and enduring ally we have in that most dangerous part of the world, the Middle East. It is the only country in that region which, like ourselves, has anchored itself in the ideals of freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. These are the things that over time have proven to be the only ground in which human rights, political stability, and economic prosperity can take root and flourish. The wider these values spread, the stronger they grow. Likewise, when they are threatened anywhere, they tend to be threatened everywhere. And what threatens them most today? More precisely, what most threatens the societies that embrace such values? It is, as it always has been, those who scorn modernity, who despise the liberty of others, and who hold all differences of peoples, cultures, and of religions in contempt. Those who, as my father said, often begin by hating Jews, but as history shows, end up hating all of us. And on the top of that list today is the jihadist movement of radical Islam, a force which has threatened the state of Israel every single day of its 7-decade existence, and it is a force which, as 9/11 showed and too many other incidents have similarly shown today, transparently threatens us all. And so, friends, when I was Prime Minister, I looked at the world and I concluded that as Canadians, we have a pretty clear choice. Either we stand up for our values and our interests right on the front line with Israel or the retreat of our values and interests in the world will accelerate, and the greatest threats will come daily to our own shores. And that is why Canadians, why Americans, why all free peoples must support the State of Israel. You know, I wish to remind Canadians, what really is the difference between the threats faced by Israel and those faced by Canada or the United States? One thing, and only one thing. The threats are much closer to Israel than they are to us. One of those threats, much closer to Israel, but common to all of us, is the threat posed by the theocratic dictatorship in Iran, and in particular by its nuclear program. Today, as Consul General Ezra mentioned, I chair an organization called the Friends of Israel Initiative. It is an international group of eminent persons and former high office holders, all non-Jewish, by the way, who are dedicated to defending and promoting the State of Israel in the international arena. In this capacity, I guess it was about a year ago, former Prime Minister Aznar of Spain and I published a piece in the Wall Street Journal. In that piece, we argued that all Western nations need, for our own sakes, to stand with Israel and against the Iranian regime. Friends, in our view, fundamentalist mullahs potentially possessing nuclear weapons is simply too dangerous a prospect for the world to tolerate. And the nuclear deal, the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, will not prevent that from happening for three reasons. First, it is hampered by its limited monitoring provisions. Second, it actually allows Iran to continue developing nuclear weapons delivery systems. And third, and most incredibly, even its weak provisions have a 10-year sunset clause. In other words, Prime Minister Aznar and I and others have argued that the deal is in essence a roadmap for Iran to obtain nuclear weapons capability in less than a decade, which of course we should never accept. So friends, I say this, and I always know I risk saying these things anywhere, including in the United States. But regardless of what views you may have of President Trump, he deserves full marks for his correct and courageous decision to pull the United States out of the JCPOA and to restore sanctions against the Israeli regime. It is the Islamic Republic of Iran, its imperialistic ambitions, and its hateful ideology that is the greatest threat to peace in the Middle East. Indeed, it is the greatest threat to peace in the world today. And the country that is the most peaceful and the least threatening in that part of the world is, in fact, the State of Israel. Let me talk about another threat that Israel and our nation share, but frankly, one that is even closer to home, because it emanates, in fact, from Western nations, and I know you've been talking about it tonight because it's of deep concern to you, and that is the BDS movement. Friends, in my view, BDS is not merely wrong. It is something much, much more sinister. You know, we live in an era of moral relativism in our societies. And look, I get it. I'm old enough to have grown up in the era of rampant moral judgmentalism. Back when I was a boy, that left a lot to be desired. But in the fertile ground of moral relativism, it is much easier to plant the seeds of very sinister notions. What BDS is, simply, is nothing more than about taking the old hatred of anti-Semitism and translating it into sophisticated intellectual language for use in polite society. People who would never say, or never want to be caught saying, that they hate and blame the Jews for their own failings and for all the problems of the world, instead declare their hatred of Israel and blame the only Jewish state for all the problems of the world. As once Jewish businesses were boycotted, today they call for a boycott of Israel. My son, Benjamin, showed me, he was an undergraduate in Canada, he's now spending all my money at Columbia. Your tuitions are a bit higher here. He didn't tell me this. Anyway, when my son was an undergraduate in Canada at Queen's University, he showed me a BDS sign that appeared on his campus. You have all this fancy intellectual rhetoric. What the BDS sign was a Star of David with a slash through it. It could have come right out of Berlin in 1938. And it is no different, friends. All these people who get up and they say, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just against Israel. Well, guess what? They had all the same views when there was no Israel. My father, go back to my father. My father, I remember him telling me, I remember the people on the intellectual left on the campuses back in the 1930s who were saying, you know, this Hitler, he's rising, he's trying to help the German people, and the German people haven't really been treated very well, and they haven't been treated very well by the Jews. All the same stuff back then. All of this only thinly masks the hatred on campuses that is directed against Jewish students, Israeli academics, and supporters of Israel generally. It is a movement of hatred. And when we face it, we must denounce it. We should not be shy. We should not be reticent. We should not be apologetic. We must denounce it at every opportunity in as loud a voice as we can. Call it for what it is. And I got to tell you, in the Parliament of Canada, I'm very proud that after I left office, my Conservative Party led a resolution to condemn BDS in the Parliament of Canada. There was a lot of humming and hawing, but ultimately it passed, and it passed with overwhelming majority. As you know, in Canada, it's a little different in Canada. I guess it's the nature of our party politics, but you can't have, and I was in Minneapolis recently, and I actually spoke in the district of Representative Omar. I was going to tell you just what I said there. In Canada, a political party can't have a representative like that in its caucus speaking overtly anti-Semitism statements without people assuming that it represents the entire party. So the right thing to do if you're really against that is for the Democratic Party to throw that person out of their organization. Friends, you either do that or you're playing both sides. It's that simple. As I've said, friends, Israel is not remotely the source of problems in the world or even in the region. Let us never forget. I know I'm telling you people here things you already know, but let me just remind you of these arguments. Never forget why peace and freedom and democracy has still not come to the rest of the Middle East. It is not because of anything Israel has done or anything Israel has not done. It is not because of Israel's failures or its imperfections, real as some of them may be. Neither Israel's existence nor Israel's policies are responsible for the instability and brutality and grinding poverty in so much of the region. The causes of these relentlessly fall well beyond the borders of Israel. In fact, to be frank, I would say that if you look at the Middle East today outside of Israel, you look outside of Israel, which is such an ethnically diverse society, for those of us who understand it, what you see is quite the contrary. What you see in the rest of the Middle East is an ongoing story of ethnic cleansing, or more specifically, to be more exact, I call it sectarian cleansing. It began some decades ago with the expulsion and the flight of Jewish minorities out of most of the countries of the region. In more recent years, the same thing began happening to the Christian communities, including, by the way, in the Palestinian territories. And now in some countries, it is happening even to Muslim minorities as well. The truth has always been that in far too many countries, it is still easier to scope-gate Israel than it is to try and copy its success. It is easier to foster resentment and hatred of Israel's democracy than it is for leaders to provide the same rights and freedoms to their own people. No, the fundamental reason, friends, why there is no peace in the Middle East today, and specifically why there has been no final settlement of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, and especially why there is still no sovereign state for the Palestinians is quite simply because there are still far too many in the Middle East, and I know this is politically incorrect to say, but there are still far too many Palestinians who have generation after generation refused to accept the right of a Jewish state to exist. I said repeatedly as Prime Minister that I favor some form of a two-state solution. Most Jewish people I know around the world favor that. The majority of Israelis I've met also favor some kind of a two-state solution. But the simple reality is that a large proportion of Palestinians simply does not. Let's just take for a moment and remind ourselves of the actual position of the Palestinian leadership on the two-state solution. Palestinian leadership claims that it accepts Israel's right to exist, but cut a little bit below the top line. It still refuses to recognize the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. More than that, it demands the, quote, right of return of countless millions of Arabs to Israel. To be clear, not to be clear, not to return to a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, but a right of return to the undisputed territory of Israel itself. This, by the way, as it also demands the removal of all Jews from a Palestinian state. So the so-called Palestinian two-state solution is this: two Arab states. One Arab state, Palestine, to be ethnically pure, cleansed of Jews, and the other Arab state, Israel, where Jews could be allowed to live as a minority. Now, my friend, Prime Minister Netanyahu, is never going to agree to that, but by the way, no Israeli leader is ever going to agree to that, and no Israeli leader should ever be pressed by the leaders of our countries to ever agree to something like that. The truth that too many will simply not face is that since 1947, the Palestinians have had frequently a choice of accepting part of the old British mandate of Palestine as their state. But on each occasion, when push has come to shove, their position has been if they can't have it all, they choose to have nothing instead. It's sad. It is very sad. Indeed, for many years now, the Palestinian Authority has refused to even go to the negotiating table. And many in the international community, by offering them diplomatic victory after diplomatic victory for refusing to negotiate, have only rewarded such self-defeating behavior. Now, friends, here's another question I'm often asked. I'm often asked, what was it like to be alone, or close to alone, at these international meetings? Some of you may recall the Francophonie and the UN and G8 and G20 and everywhere else. I got in these positions where I seemed to be alone defending Israel. Well, first of all, I got to tell you this. First of all, the situation is not particularly surprising. I just tell you to look at the world of diplomacy. I wish I could tell you that it's all about lofty ideals. Of course, it is not. I wish I could tell you that it's just even about national interest. But I got to tell you, my experience was it's often not even about that. The truth is that it's often about doing nothing more than what is easiest. And with 24 Arab states, and 5 Muslim states, and one solitary Jewish state, the easiest path is often to just go along to get along with every anti-Israeli resolution, whether you believe it or not. Of course, I face this on a regular basis, and by the way, I face this not just in dealing with other countries. I face this from time to time. You don't cover your ears here, Consul General. I face this from time to time in dealing with my own Foreign Affairs Department in Ottawa. I could give you numerous examples, but I got to tell you there's one I'll never forget. We were planning, in 2011, we were planning a media event around the so-called Arab Spring out of our Foreign Affairs Department. And frankly, it was around the consular assistance we were going to offer to Canadian citizens who were in the region at that time when these revolutions began to break out all over the place. So I went over to the Foreign Affairs building, Lester B. Pearson building they call it, and they had a room staged for me, and behind me they had a map. They had created a map of the Middle East as a backdrop to my briefing. was just one problem. The state of Israel was left off the map entirely, as if it did not exist, which unfortunately is an attitude in many diplomatic circles. I kept that map in my office for the rest of my time in office just to remind me what we were up against. But I can also tell you this. Let me also tell you this is interesting. In private meetings with world leaders, I often wasn't really alone at all. Many leaders agreed with the positions I took, and were glad I took them in private. But once the cameras rolled, it was a different matter. Because the truth is that in many countries today, if we think it is bad here or in Canada, I can tell you that in many countries today, any politician who supports Israel will face a torrent of unrelenting media venom. I got some of it in Canada, not as bad as some European politicians will get it. But look, just remember this: speak truth with conviction, and the vast majority of the population will get it. I tell people that notwithstanding, if you went to Canada and looked at coverage of my position on Israel and the Middle East during my time of office, you would think that no one supported me. But the truth of the matter, my position was a majority position, and support for that position actually went up during our term of office. So much so that my Liberal successors have found that they can only reverse those positions very carefully and very slowly and at their peril. I should also mention that the Conservative Party of Canada, which is now under the leadership of the Honourable Andrew Scheer, who just reduced the Liberals to a minority in our national elections, he has committed to follow the lead of the United States and others and do the right thing and move Canada's embassy in Israel to where it belongs, in Jerusalem. I tell people that when President Trump made that move, it was one of the very few times I wished I was actually back in office so I could have stood with Donald Trump on that occasion. But I must admit there are many times where I'm glad I don't have to stand with President Trump. Anyway, I'm off to Israel tomorrow. I run a business now, Harper and Associates. We do some business there. We are involved in investing in the Israeli cybersecurity industry and moving some of its products and opportunities to North America. I'm also off, I should mention this, somebody said I should mention, off to the Hula Valley, where the Jewish National Fund is honoring me and my wife Lorene by naming the new interpretive center at the Hula Valley Bird Sanctuary after us. So we are indeed honored. Anyway, let me just conclude with this before I leave for Israel. Just never be afraid to take the right position on these issues and never be reluctant to be proud of Israel. I tell people that Israel has been built from virtually nothing in just 3 generations by the remnants of populations who had been almost annihilated. And it has in that period become one of the most successful countries on earth. It is literally an oasis of wealth, freedom, culture, innovation, and security in the most troubled and dangerous part of the world. It faces daily extraordinary threats and dangers while doing its utmost to maintain standards of justice and fair treatment for all, even for its enemies. In short, I believe that the modern state of Israel may be the most remarkable country that has ever been created. And, friends, let me also assure you that whatever the media or the intellectuals or BDS may say, that whole crowd, there are millions of people in my country, not of Jewish faith or background, just as there are hundreds of millions more around the world who join us in our admiration of what Israel has accomplished in just 7 short decades. I want to thank you again for the invitation to be here. I greatly admire the work you do at StandWithUs, and I'm honored to have had the opportunity to share these remarks with you. Merci beaucoup.